Шановні журналісти, вітання. Ми продовжуємо робочий день.
Dear journalists, we continue our working day in USMC. Before we start our briefing, I would like to announce that our briefing at 3 p.m. about release of the final report on technical investigation into flight MH17 crash is cancelled. Currently, we are discussing the Russia's hybrid war against Ukraine, causes, consequences, lessons, and challenges. And we have Ivan Kostov, former Prime Minister of Bulgaria, Ruslan Kavatsyuk, advisor to the Chief of Armed Forces, General Staff, and Anatoly Baronin, managing partner of the analytical agency, the Vinci Group. Good afternoon. I'm Ivan Kostov. I have an experience of reforms in Bulgaria, and currently I'm working for the analytical analysis and risk assessment centers. Our yesterday, we have 12 documents which are devoted to the crisis and war in Ukraine, and one of them, out of them, is called the report on the hybrid war in Ukraine. This report was produced to explain the term hybrid war itself. At the beginning of the 2013, under the so-called electronic war or hybrid war, we understand the following things. This is propaganda war by means of the mass media, including internet sites, cyber subversive actions, adverse cyber crimes, cyber adversive actions, also collection of information and data, dissemination of viruses and penetration into informational networks and cyber war, and the war in course of discussions in internet, or the war via discussions in internet. Specifically trolls. Russian system of electronic war, of cyber war, is the best developed in the world. It developed from the Second World War till today. And currently it uses the most updated methods of communications. And those means of hybrid war are used to manipulate with the public opinion for collection of civic information. This method, this tool is based on the so-called Kremlin consensus. The Kremlin consensus, even before the war, comprised the following things. How it was seen, reproduced by President Putin. These were liberals aiming to modernize Russia and the image of this modernization in the world. Also, these were people among national chauvinists, including Dugin, paramilitary groups and their representatives, and military elite represented by Shoigu. That consensus reflects the tools of the propaganda war and strategies, the protective elements of that war. They reflect the legends of that war and the main propaganda elements. I will provide several examples of this propaganda war. The first thing that the war began quite in advance, long before the Russia entered Crimea. It started in early 2013, around early January, 5th January, for example. The beginning of it was the use of the term fascists to Kiev leadership at that time. Thus, they created the first legend, preparing the public opinion in Russia towards aggression against Ukraine. They managed to enter and block Crimea before bringing the military there. There exists the document saying that Crimea was that Crimea was in informational blockade. The Russia managed to conquer actually the Ukrainian media in Donbass. They wanted to manipulate the Russian population, saying that the mass media will be purely broadcasting in Ukrainian, and Russian-speaking people were afraid of this. There are some more signs of the hybrid war. The first, there is a huge flow of Ukrainian population which leaves Ukraine. With this aim, the checkpoint between Ukraine, the border of Ukraine and Poland was removed. The second example, the repeal of the law on regional languages, which was represented as reactional and the third were murders of Russians, the murders of Russian citizens in Simferopol, which later were discovered not to be murders, actually. All these facts later this were later established that they were untrue, but this was not publicly recognized. The Kremlin consensus split after shutting down MH17 and the murder of Boris Nemtsov. After Donetsk, Donbass region separated from Ukraine. First, the liberals split, fall out from this consensus. This was going on gradually. Then the national chauvinists lost their position, lost their grounds. Then the paramilitary groups also stepped back from that, fallout from that consensus, and And now the consensus is closely interrelated with Putin and the elite around here and military elite around him. Who was awarded with the war in Syria. But propaganda machine is now weakened because it now does not have the objective. And a couple of words about Bulgaria. The same instruments, the same tools and similar war is led against Bulgaria. Bulgarian people do not know about Minsk agreements. You cannot find those Minsk agreements in Bulgarian language. Minsk agreements were represented in a form of a handshake between Poroshenko and Putin. And also there was a statement that a special constitution will gain a special status to Donbass. In Bulgaria, it is unclear whether Donbass will remain in Ukraine. And it is not clear that finally it will remain part of Ukraine. On Bulgarian websites, there is now a fierce fighting with trolleys and we definitely know who administered those trawlers. They administered from the territory which belongs to Mr. Putin. We have no doubts that this is organized by him, and this is organized, well organized. Also, I noticed that recently that they decreased the number of the intensity of that propaganda, and they decreased the number of myths they are communicating. Maybe the reason is that Ukraine has signed association with the association agreement with the EU. Also, the elections of the president and new parliament were held, and Minsk elections were signed. And the United Nations gave its approval to these actions and condemned the Russian aggression. And we observe how Ukraine is able to defend itself. And we will continue to observe how Ukraine will protect itself from the information war. Any questions? Upon request of our guest, I will transfer to Russia because there is better understanding of Russian, although it is not very convenient to me, and I have to apologize for my unintentional use of Russian words. Now we better understand what were the stages of a hybrid war waged by Russia against its neighbors. We understand that Russia used this hybrid war against all its neighbors in different moments of time and different stages. And currently we understand that Russia and its leadership tested and tried the level of patience in international community. They tested their tolerance to different elements of the hybrid war, and now we need to recognize that Russian leadership was rather efficient in application of the hybrid war elements. They successfully applied it against Estonia. They successfully implemented cyber attacks upon Estonia. They efficiently used public rallies in the Estonian capital some time ago. They also used informational elements of the hybrid war against Belarus and Russia in the early 20s. During this decade, they applied the new methods against Georgia in August 2008, and we have to recognize that in the war against Georgia, Russian Federation managed to make lower the tolerance threshold. That is, Russian Federation were not published for the aggression against Georgia and was inspired to continue their aggressive policy further. We have to recognize that hybrid war elements were used against Ukraine, have been used against Ukraine for 10 years almost now, and since there is no effective offensive measures from Ukrainian and from Ukrainian side, Russia continued to raise its hybrid war, which reflected in occupation of Crimea and also in intervention into Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. In result of the betrayal of in the result of the active oppression of Ukrainian services, of Ukrainian civil society, and of Ukrainian patriots, upon which the Russians did not account for, the Russian Federation was repealed in Ukraine due to the decision of the High Commander of Ukraine in summer last year. The Russians experienced several fierce defeats in the occupied territories, military defeat, and thus part of military detachments were destroyed, and part of Donetsk and Lugansk regions was liberated in result of military actions and in result of the fact that Russian hybrid units were defeated. Russia started its military aggression on August 24th last year. This was an act of despair on behalf of the Russian leadership, because they wanted to prevent total defeat, and in result of this direct invasion of Russian army, Russia experienced huge losses because of sanctions, and the situation escalates. The situation in economy worsens, and each step when they make or which they try to make results in worsening of the situation. As for Ukrainian people managed to get mobilized and to start defensive hybrid war against Russian Federation. We used the elements of hybrid war against Russian attack. We have to confess and to recognize that we made a lot of mistakes in our counteraction. We have to recognize that aggressors are cynical and they are well prepared. We have to recognize that in result of informational operations of the Russian troops, Ukrainian army was defeated, fiercely defeated several times. Here I would like to mention Ilovaisk encircling and some others, but at the same time, Ukrainian army won several military victories over Russian army, which unfortunately were not adequately covered by mass media. Ukrainian army managed to defeat Russian regular army near Lugansk in August last year. The defeat was so strong that they repelled and stepped back beyond the border without any military order from their commander, and they were they had so huge losses that they ran away into Russian territory very quickly. In result of the huge losses of Russian Federation in August last year, we prevented the offensive of Russian troops near Mariupol, and tomorrow there will be a first night show of the raid documentary telling this story. The Russian offensive last year was stopped in result of the huge losses among the private of the Russian army. The Russian media confirmed in result of their own investigations confirmed that Russian losses several times were several times higher than the Ukrainian troops, but at the same time the Russians lead this war not with the regular, not only with their regular army, but with the hybrid army. These are militants, these are people recruited from local population, these are veterans of the previous military conflicts, these are mercenaries of all sorts, and all those people are involved to the Russian united forces and organize the bandit attacks inspired by Russian Federation. That's why now we can state that the losses of hybrid Russian troops are several times higher than the losses of Ukrainian armed forces. The biggest problem for Ukrainian side here is that we are waging war in our own territory, and we are very much limited in the methods of those military actions, because acting in the war field, we are continuously thinking of peaceful population, of the civilians, while the enemies use terrorist methods. They put artillery systems close to residential areas, close to kindergartens, close to schools, and start shelling of Ukrainian positions. Those who understand the basics of the artillery fighting understand that the artillerists immediately calculate the source of this fire. They immediately respond, and since we are speaking about very far distances, the shells which come back can target the neighborhood, the immediate neighborhood around the artillery systems which initiated the fire, and this creates a big probability that they might shell the school, the kindergarten, the residential building, and while this is very carefully shot by Russian journalists who immediately report that Ukrainian army are shelling civil targets, and this is the tactics which is used by the terrorists in Israel. This is the same tactics which is used by the Russians in Ukraine, in line with the data of our intelligence and Ukrainian reconnaissance. All the militants, all the commanders among the militants, hybrid troops in Ukraine, these were the Russians regulars from armed forces. All the militants who were mentioned as leaders of so-called terrorist groups, DNR and LNR, DPR or LPR, they were gradually deprived from the command of the military units, and now the command comes directly from Russians. That is, Russian hybrid aggression is not anymore a secret war. Now the entire world knows about their methods. Now our Western partners attentively study these methods and develop the response measures and the means of hybrid war which are used by Russia now. They are carefully studied and reflected in new recommendations, new developed measures to counteract them in the future. For us, it is very pleasant to see that our partners from the European Union undertake deep analysis, deep study of the methods Russia uses in hybrid war in Ukraine, and all of them know that today Ukraine ranges war for the values of the Western democracies. We stand for freedom, for the right to self-determination, and for the right to repel any attempts of the foreign state to impose any policy courses. Ukraine has made a decision to integrate to Europe and NATO structures. The Russian Federation tries to deprive Ukraine from this path, and we continue. We range defensive war against Russian Federation in our own territory. We are sure in our victory. And this means that we will liberate both Donetsk, Lugansk Oblast and Autonomous Republic of Crimea sooner or later. Thank you.
Thank you. And for convenience of our guest, I will speak Russian too. And I would like to speak about several issues concerning the fact why hybrid war became possible now, because we know that the necessary components of the war are regulatory divisions of the enemy, and the second component is the militants, the organizations of militants and movements. The third component are mass media, and the fourth is cyber attacks. And regular army, together with militants and movements, was rather active during the last 50 years. In Second Congolese War, for example, at the same time, the use of mass media is also isn't a new means, because these operations were conducted after the Second World War in the local conflicts. But we understand that radically new is the coalition of these components and the increased role in mass media in the military actions and the influence on militants and civilians in the confrontation zone. And here we should mention that information means allowed to use maximally efficiently the mass media in order to promote military actions. And several years ago, the information went vertically from top to the bottom, and the main mass media they provided some information, and then this information traveled to less reputable mass media. And due to digital information, communication, and internet, the post, for example, in Facebook can be transferred to the prominent channels, and this improved the mobility of information space. But from the other side, It gives the possibility to provide information that is that the enemy may benefit from. And we also understand that the change in the structure of mass media and the emergence of internet changed the approach to assessment of information and formation of that media pool that is used by the public. And before, the priority and the reputability of the media was estimated by information provided and its popularity. Nowadays, this assessment is changed as hosts and that led to the possibility to increase the flow of information in time, and prominent channels, main channels, previously had limited resources to provide information connected to, because they had some limits, and the newspapers were limited by number of places and the number of pages. Now the information resources, they just provide the opportunity to increase data that is published at the same time. So the information there's more information, and because the amount of information is increased, the fact-checking is decreased. And this is the key problem. And it allows the enemy to send information that was not checked or disinformation. And that is the volume of information in the mass media doesn't allow people to check information and to conduct cross-checking in other sources of information. Moreover, the key problem nowadays is the emergence of new mass media, so-called pseudo-mass media, that apart from reprinting, they try to infiltrate their own information in the interest of the enemy. And this creates a new problem of checking. So to verify the source of information, we see now that even prominent sources of information, they just pass this information from the sources that are pro-Russian or that they have Russian registration. Thus, it is necessary to take into account the psychology and changing psychology in understanding of this information. The increased data that goes in the media that is due to technology creates psychological effect on people. And for example, if we compare news that were provided in 90s or about 2001, 2002, and the economic situation was rather comparable, and compared it with the data that is available today in the mass media in the period of 2014, 2015, we see the emotional component that is heightened in the content, and the reduction of content of the news. And this allows to replace information by the enemy and load it with emotional component. And this is a dangerous situation because people start to become accustomed to consume emotional content, and they don't analyze information. And today, they think that effective war with propaganda should be such a counter-propaganda, and the use of information that is true and that provide proper facts. But we understand that today there is a segmentation of audience, and those people who have pro-Ukrainian orientation in the circumstances of free access to media, they won't choose Russian sources and vice versa. Those who are pro-Russian, they won't use mass media from pro-Ukrainian media. And this division emerges the ineffectiveness of counter propaganda as a whole, on the whole. And we should recognize that the efficiency of fight against information component of hybrid war in conditions of open information society and freedom of speech, in circumstances of freedom of work of representatives of mass media, is impossible. Because any steps to fight with propaganda can only be made in limitation of sources. Otherwise, we will face the increase of media resources from the side of the enemy that will reduce all our efforts of counter-propaganda from our side and of the side of our partners.
We have to recognize, in fact, that further development of information society, information technologies will further promote the spread of hybrid war, and gradually the hybrid war will cover new and new territories and cover more and more potential victims in the territories of those local conflicts. Thank you for your attention. Probably we should now shift to Q&A session. We have the first question. We would like to shift to discussion. What were the main conclusion in Bulgaria? If the main counteraction is in the comments, then who has to pay for these comments? Whether we should have public policy counteracting to hybrid war, whether what should Ukrainian structures in order to respond to what is called Russian propaganda? And the question to you, yes, stated that in conditions of the open society, it is impossible to counteract to this phenomenon. Then what should we do? Either to arrange some public awareness course or whatever. First of all, this is the not just the counteraction with trolling, but also facts that demonstrate that arguments of the electronic war are not true. The major factor of war against Ukraine is the defeat of Russia. The defeat of Russia. And the main defeat of Russia, Russian propaganda, is the following fact, that huge gap in perception and ideas of the Russians and Ukrainians. That is a back process could not happen. That is, Ukrainians are unable to ensure the back process. In Bulgaria, our position is to popularize the Ukrainian position. And further on, we add information on each event which was covered by the media. And these are purely facts. These are facts about what's going on the Ukrainian side. And we provide the facts supporting Ukraine, which is having losses. Here, I mean those major facts. Here, I mean those major facts which changed the attitude to Ukraine and Bulgaria. Ukraine has signed association agreement, and it is a very close country to Bulgaria. It's understandable to us. The next fact is the concern whether Russia can do the same with Bulgaria, with Bulgarian territory, as it did with the Ukrainian territory. These are concerns related to the Russian information war, which was successfully arranged in Estonia, in the Baltic countries. This is the fear which prevents people in Estonia and Baltic countries that Russian hybrid war may cover them. Unfortunately, Ukrainian information policy was not launched on time, and Ukrainian information policy was not at the proper level. It started to develop with some time lag, and it wasn't focused enough. It was not targeting and some specific things. It was not efficient. And we speak about what already had happened. I would like to say what is our main objective when we try to tackle the issue of the Kremlin information policy. The major problem is to demonstrate all that lie, all that untrue, and under these conditions, Ukraine and Bulgaria understand how harmful it can be. And that informational war is ranged for the sake to deprive the Bulgarians from their European future. And the Russians want to demonstrate that both Bulgarians and Ukrainians have chosen wrong way for their development, and they build up their propaganda on this major statement for the future. And the only way to counteract this propaganda is to raise economic welfare of people. On whose account you should arrange that counter-propaganda. Of course, the state institutions should range this propaganda, this counter-propaganda. Of course, there could not be just one answer to your question, because the hybrid war per se and as invention of Russian Federation is based on humiliating the values of the democracy. And when we speak about possible counteractions to propaganda, this is about liberating of the information space from lie. But in open society, we cannot speak about state regulation of internet or about state instructions prescribing people what to post in social networks, what not to post. But the data show that up to 50% of likes and shares in social networks are done without reading the piece of information up to the very end. That is, people respond emotionally and react emotionally. That's why we cannot prescribe any universal approach to counteraction. Maybe in higher educational institutions, in universities, we should teach students this information hygiene, how to sort out that social media. But we cannot say how efficient it might be. Also, we might think about symmetrical actions on behalf of the state services in respect of the aggressive party in order to restore fair balance with the with the information to population in Ukraine, and then the state cannot ban some internet resources. I did not mean this, but the state policy should be based on the analysis of risks to the national security. The most efficient way is to establish public trust in the leadership of the country and in the course of this leadership. The efficient response to the propaganda war could be provided by politicians and political leaders and leaders of public opinion, no public trust. What is necessary? That is, each negative statement put forward by the opposite side should be counterstated by the specific statement on the other side, and with a specific indication of the sources of the arguments which are true and which are reliable. When the term political propaganda appeared, political leaders should immediately check the facts and sources and respond to and annihilate this propaganda, actually. Thank you very much. Do we have further questions to our guests? If we do not have the questions, I would ask the question on myself. This is the question to Ruslan, probably. He said much about counteraction to information war from Ukrainian state. Could you please answer how the facts about Lugansk victory were communicated to Ukrainian soldiers? Near Lugansk, Ukrainian army won a victory over Russian regular army. In this case, we do not speak about the victory in information field, because after defeat of their army, Russian propaganda managed to prevent this fact from penetrating into the public information. The Ukrainian defeat near Ilovaisk was very widely and loudly communicated, while Russian defeat near Lugansk was not communicated so loudly, and Russian counter-propaganda was very efficient in hiding this fact. From the army point of view, this is a good proof that Russian army is as strong as it pretends to be, and they are exaggerating their mighty and the defeats in the military field. They tend to hide them, but the victories which they won, they tend to exaggerate and do this effectively. And they do both things very effectively. They hide and they celebrate. But Ukrainian army, as of today, acts and fights more efficiently, that it manages to communicate this into the public space. Yemets Maria, UCMC. You mentioned that currently there is a huge split between the part of society living with the Ukrainian media sources and that part of population which stuck with Russian or pro-Russian sources of information. Whether there is a strategy how to bring that pro-Russian population using pro-Russian sources to the field of influence of Ukrainian propaganda or pro-Ukrainian sources. I'll try to answer this question from the public information point of view. It's not my personal answer. It's generally known what I let you know. There are a lot of surveys about occupied territories. They do not have any access to Ukrainian information, to Ukrainian mass media, but there is intensive presence of Russian television and Russian media. And Russian propaganda is very strong there. At the same time, opinion polls show that there is a part of population which is very actively involved into this, the sense of propaganda, and becomes the rangers of this propaganda war. There is part of population which remains indifferent. They listen to this propaganda, but when the TV is switched off, then some weeks pause starts, and after this pause the television is switched on. This part of population starts to change its point of view. This is well known by Russian Federation, and they fully realize that when the Russian broadcasting is switched off and the multiple plural points of view are broadcast upon this territory, they immediately will lose a big part of people whom they influence now. When you hear that the elections will be held in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, please keep in mind that the preconditions are switching off the occupational mass media and switching on to the Ukrainian legal field, including Ukrainian mass media, and thus part of Ukrainian population who are now under the impact of Russian propaganda, they will get access to elections. Of course, this will be not all the people, but the majority of them. I probably will express more pessimistic point of view because this deals with the perception of information. When we say that population in the occupied territory got accustomed to emotionally colored information, then in case Russian mass media are switched off and they try to switch on switch into Ukrainian sources, the trust may be not as high as to the Russian ones, because the Ukrainian media are not as emotional as Russian. And after this period of higher stress and emotional load from mass media, this transfer to peaceful life may result in the feeling of some insufficiency, of some deficiency. And by the way, via internet we can easily watch Russian channels, and we may expect that those people will try to watch these channels on internet. That's why I do not think that adaptation into Ukrainian information space will take a longer period, just around 1 year, even maybe several years. I would like to add about the terms, but I think that the most important thing is to stick with the Minsk agreements and the implementation. As soon as Ukraine restores control over its border with Russia, what is required by Minsk agreements, then the division of people into parts could be overcome sooner or later. This will require patience, of course, and tolerance and insistence. The major thing is to restore Ukrainian control over its border. Thank you very much. I would like to ask the last question to our Bulgarian guest. Many people used to characterize Bulgaria as a pro-Russian country in general, and Southern Stream confirms this idea. It's very interesting that you presented your vision of Russian propaganda. Could you please characterize the general attitude of Bulgarians in general? Are they more pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian? And could you explain whether there is Russian propaganda in Bulgaria?
Taking into account the last 3 elections, what happened in Bulgaria, there are pro-Russian views in Bulgaria. Pro-European views. The views are pro-European. This is testified by pro-Russian power was lost during previous elections. Pro-Russian parties, they were defeated at last elections. And as to the mass media, the situation is rather difficult. Especially in newspapers, on TV, Russian propaganda is still there and is really active. but it doesn't influence the main views of the people. For Bulgaria, the fact that Ukraine is the associate member is the factor that Ukraine is close to Bulgaria and their relations will develop in a positive way. Facts are stronger than propaganda. We'll hope that everyone will know the facts, not only propaganda. We finish our press conference, and yesterday we're going to watch a film. It is called Raid, and it will be broadcast through all Ukrainian channels. But it is about Ukrainian paratroopers, and our briefing at 3 p.m.